Namaskar friends. Today we are going to start a new module of the stress management course. This is module 10 which focuses on the use of defense mechanisms as a tool to reduce stress. This is lecture 1 of module 10. Let us have a quick recap of what we are going to study in this particular lecture. In this lecture, we will learn about coping strategies, primarily the use of defense mechanisms. And the defense mechanisms which have been covered in this particular presentation are acting out, rationalization, reaction formation, sublimation and suppression. So, let us begin with our discussion and see what defense mechanism is. Coping, as we all know, are the strategies in terms of actions, thoughts and feelings which used to help people adapt to life changes and improve how they feel. Most of the time, the changes which come to us abruptly or quickly can be stressogenic. In order to mitigate that stress, we try to engage in different kind of corrective or adaptive behaviors. Because it is challenging to cope with changes which are causes of lowering self-esteem, which can potentially lead to anxiety, depression or physical changes, we need to come up with a number of coping methods. Usually, the two basic ways to cope with stresses is cognitive appraisal, that is we try to change our perception about the situation, or we try to change our emotions, we try to regulate our emotions, and sometimes we try to detach intense emotions from the stressor, from the situation, which was initially very stressful as it was causing a lot of negative emotions. Now, when we focus on emotion regulation, there is a particular type of mechanism which is known as defense mechanism which comes to play. This defense mechanism was initially introduced by Sigmund Freud. We all have heard the name of Sigmund Freud, a legendary psychologist and psychoanalyst who came up with his psychoanalysis theory. In his theory, he divided the personality into three parts: unconscious, subconscious and conscious. And similarly, he proposed three arms of our ego structure, that is id, which is the unconscious part, and it is composed of the desires, the wants, the wishes, which are known as id impulses. The second arm was the superego, which is the moral arm of our self. It contains all the ethical values, the moral values which are preached by the society. And the third, which is more real arm, reality oriented arm, is known as ego. So, ego has a basic task to make a balance between superego and id. Moreover, it tries to fulfill the id impulses in a socially sanctioned manner in order to avoid any potential harm due to becoming unsocial or antisocial in accomplishing one's goals. So, what happens that ego has different kind of mechanisms to protect our self concept, to protect our self esteem. Whenever we feel that we have done something wrong, or we have some thoughts in our mind which are highly inappropriate or condemnable, it may dent our own self concept, our self esteem. It may put us in a state of shame or guilt. So, ego has a particular type of mechanism which safeguards such harms, and that is why this is called defense mechanisms. The idea was initially proposed by Sigmund Freud and later on elaborated by his daughter and his successor, Dr. Anna Freud. Anna Freud identified 10 major defense mechanisms, and the list was further expanded by other psychoanalysts who gradually came to field. Anna Freud, while defining defense mechanism, says that these are the automatic tactics which are used by the ego to reduce inner distress. Individuals commonly adopt these subconscious strategies. One must notice that these strategies operate on a subconscious level. So, if you adopt one or the other defense mechanism, it doesn't mean that you are actually intentionally manipulating things. Everything is happening subconsciously. So, the person using defense mechanisms may not be aware of the fact that he or she is doing it. What is the use of adopting such defense mechanism? The basic purpose is to manage the conflict within themselves. Now, why this conflict is happening? Because it has its own demand and it wants to fulfill those demands at any cost, whereas superego exists there as a moral arm, and it keeps checking the id impulses by saying that this is appropriate, this is inappropriate, we must not think like this, we must not act like this is not our right to enter into this situation, but the id is not ready to listen to it. So, there is a condition of conflict between these two aspects of an individual's personality, and ego is there to resolve this conflict, because whenever there is a conflict, stress builds up, and if the conflict is inner, it is even more stressful, and it is very important to reduce that stress. Therefore, ego adopts some kind of defense mechanism to safeguard the self from any kind of potential damage. Here is the first defense mechanism which we are going to discuss about, and this is known as acting out. Acting out means the formation of damaging behaviors that take attention and motivation away from other stressor could potentially serve as a defense mechanism for individuals with conduct disorder, antisocial personality disorder, or oppositional defiant disorder. Even for people who are high in traits of hostility and aggression, this is a popular defense mechanism. Now, what do I mean when I say that adopting another damaging behavior can take my attention away from the actual stressor? You might have noticed that people usually scream, they shout at each other, they start fighting, they start breaking objects. Even small children, they all come up showing this kind of behavior. Remember a very popular movie, Tare Zameen Par? What the main artist of that movie was doing? He was engaged in fighting with his friends, he was showing defiance towards the parents and the teachers, and at the end of the day what we came to know about him, that the child was suffering from learning disorder, he was suffering from reading disorder, and because he could not cope with the stress successfully, he engaged in other type of behaviors which were damaging for oneself as well as for others, in order to take attention away from the actual cause. Now, for children, this is quite acceptable because they are still immature. They are not cognitively mature so that they can express their stress in the appropriate way, and they can analyze their own self and they understand what the problem is so that it can be solved. But what if adults keep on doing the same kind of behavior? Most of us, when get stuck with one kind of problem or the other kind which we are not able to solve, or when we realize that we have committed some kind of mistakes due to which negative emotions are building up, we are feeling stress, what we try to do? We start shouting, we start finding, we start throwing objects. Now, these damaging behaviors, because they are intense enough, They can simply disorient the whole scenario, snatching the attention away from the actual problem and focusing it on some other issue. Suicide is also an example of this kind of behavior. So, instead of showing our emotion in a more matured way, instead of discussing the problems properly, communicating them, doing introspections, identifying the actual stressor and then working upon it, either to change the situation or to upskill oneself, to enhance one's own resources to cope, one is simply engaging in a more damaging behavior so that the previous problem can become less important. Okay. So, this is the basic mechanism of acting out. What are the consequences of acting out? Obviously, it has many negative consequences, including damaging relationships. If you keep fighting with your family members or with your colleagues, obviously your relationships will be strained with them. It actually increases stress because there was one problem, and in order to take your attention away from the actual problem, you engaged in some more damaging behavior, creating a new front of stressgenic situation. So, there may be a short time fleet from the actual problem. It is in no way going to reduce the stress actually for the person. This also has known consequences for one's mental health. So, impacting mental health is also common. What could be an alternative to such behavior? An alternative to such behavior can be verbal expression of your problem. You can engage yourself in some other physical activity which is benign, which is not damaging. Maybe you can start playing or start playing some musical instrument or anything else. And then relaxation and mindfulness training can help you introspecting in a better way without getting anxious, without sinking into the feeling of guilt, and then you can manage the emotions nicely. Coming to the second defense mechanism. When someone justifies their behavior by offering a reasonable explanation instead of telling the actual intention behind the behavior, it is known as rationalization. So, we try to rationalize what we have done or rationalize what has happened to us. Okay. You might have read about the character of Robin Hood. He was a hero for poor people because he used to snatch money from rich and distribute it to the poor instead of keeping it for himself. Now, this could be an example of rationalization. Snatching money from other people cannot be legalized, it cannot be socially approved. But when you take money from riches and distribute it to poor, it somehow help you to overcome the guilt of being indulged in an inappropriate action, which is not socially sanctioned, which is considered illegal. Okay. So, this kind of defense mechanism can help the person reduce the stress for the time being, but somehow it distorts the actual social situation, the actual intentions, and somehow people start believing in those alternative explanations only. So, what happens, the actual reason lies some at the back of their mind, in their unconscious mind, and at some later point of time it may convert its form, it may cause some sort of mental health issue for them. Many times what happens, if I talk about the academic life of all of us, what we have done, even everybody of us has sometimes missed the deadlines of submitting assignments, and then we started telling reasons and excuses which were all related to the external world, that this was happened, that is why I could not complete my assignment and submit it timely. So, this is also an example of rationalization. One thing that you should note, that defense mechanisms has a range of intensity. Sometimes they can be very mild, they can be very benign, on the other hand they can be very intense, correct. For example, killing somebody and then trying to rationalize could be an intense example of using defense mechanism. On the other hand, giving simple excuses for being late for 10 or 15 minutes, attributing the responsibilities to the external environment could be an example of mild use of defense mechanism. So, there is a whole range, right. Every time we come up with defense mechanisms or maybe rationalization, if I talk about it particularly, it is not all the same. It ranges from mild and acceptable to very intense and sometimes unacceptable use of rationalization. It usually helps to maintain a positive self image and avoid accountability for an action or a word. However, it can lead to a lack of personal growth by preventing individuals from learning from mistakes and impair relationships, creating a lack of accountability and trust. The next popular defense mechanism, which is used by most of us, is reaction formation. Before we delve into the technical discussions, if I try to explain this concept in a very simple and plain manner, reaction formation means hiding one's actual feelings and acting in an entirely different manner. So, if I actually don't like a person, I will act in an overly generous manner towards him or her. This would be an example of reaction formation. Okay. So, whatever was my true intention, true emotion towards that person, if I find it socially unacceptable or if I find it risky expressing them out, what will I do? I will try to substitute my actual emotions, or maybe I try to hide my actual emotions beside a behavior, an action which conveys an entirely different set of emotions, which could be very positive. So, now if you go through the text which is given on your slide, it says that reaction formation happens when one decides to replace their original impulse with the contrasting one pertaining to a situation or a concept. The way I explained that if I don't like a person, but I don't find it either appropriate or unsafe to reflect my true feeling, I would behave in a manner as if I were very happy with the person and I actually like him or her a lot. Okay. So, reaction formation can be identified in instances where an individual show exaggerated kindness towards another individual whom they hold animosity towards. It is when someone acts in a way that is the opposite of how they really feel in order to avoid anxiety or criticism from others. What is the use of reaction formation? It helps individuals avoid social disapproval. As I said, sometimes it is socially inappropriate to show your dislike, to show your anger, to show your emotion towards somebody due to the social norms, due to something else. So, if you adopt the defense mechanism of reaction formation, this will help you in avoiding such unpleasant happenings. You can manage your anxiety for the time being, but this will lead to an inauthentic behavior and inner conflict. I have certain set of values, but I am showing an entirely set of actions in my behavior. So, these were the three main defense mechanisms we covered in this presentation, and The rest of them will be covered sequentially in coming lectures. Let us have a recap of what we have learned today. Coping mechanisms are definitely ways people adapt to adjust to their emotional stress in difficult situations. Some coping mechanisms are counterproductive. Counterproductive means which are adopted to get a certain result, but instead of leading the person to the desired outcome, they started behaving in a way, or they resulted in something which is actually contrary to what we wanted. So, we adopted defense mechanisms in order to reduce stress. Yes, they seems to reduce stress for the time being, but in the long run they are going to increase the level of stress by worsening the situations. So, defense mechanisms can be put under the category of counterproductive mechanisms. Apart from that, we have problem focused coping, where we directly operate upon the problems. These coping mechanisms will be dealt with in the next module. And then emotion focused coping, of which defense mechanism was an example. We talked about acting out coping, we talked about rationalization and reaction formation, whereas sublimation and suppression will be dealt with in the coming lectures. These are the references that you can go through for further enhancement of your knowledge. List of books and references continues. Here are some more books. Thank you very much for your patient listening.